Thank you, Chef. And my friends, yeah, thank you all so much for joining us for this afternoon to talk about tea. I'm particularly obsessed with tea. I founded a small tea company called JoJo Tea in 2011. I had been a yoga teacher before that, and I was working at a small Buddhist temple where I was learning to teach meditation, or at least I thought that I was learning how to teach meditation. But the teacher was a Taiwanese tea master, and I didn't even know there was such a thing as a tea master. But she taught me a lot about tea and about the connection between tea and meditation. I don't think it's a coincidence that no matter what culture it is in the world, a cup of tea is seen as a moment of peace. Whether it's Australia, South Africa, Argentina, Alaska, New Orleans, Portland, anywhere in the world, a cup of tea is this moment of peace. And I think that that kind of fascinated me, and I got very into the Chinese tea practice integrated with meditation. But I found that very quickly that it was only the teas that I got from this Buddhist temple that were good enough to drink tea with meditation. All the other teas were flavored, and they didn't have this. And you could only brew them once, because if you brewed them once, you rinsed off all the flavoring. So I was looking for just pure teas, and I couldn't find any. So I made it a mission to start a small tea company, and like I said, that was back in 2011. Today we service over 300 accounts. Restaurants, coffee shops, hotels, and bakeries. We have a small tea room, which is where we're recording this session. And I was recently recognized at 2019 International Tea Masters Cup. It's the first time ever that America, we're live. Everything okay? Okay. So it was my fault. So it was, just really quick to finish up this introduction. So the Tea Masters Cup is an international tournament where we basically every country, there's 27 countries that compete, and we all try to find the tea master for each country. Then they all go to the international competition. 2019 was the first year that America competed in the Tea Masters Cup, and I, luckily enough, very fortunately won. I'm a Cuban kid from Miami, so I think it's a big coincidence that I get to represent America at the Tea Masters Cup. But obviously the international competition was canceled because of COVID, so it's kind of suspended. But that's where my background in tea comes, to be able to discuss this with you, and I sincerely hope that you might learn something of value. I think that tea is something that, if you're a real tea lover, you drink tea just about every day or frequently. And it represents a practice and a hobby and a habit and a moment that I think we all treasure for many different reasons. So I sincerely hope that I can share something of value to you.
Awesome.
So, all right.
So you're basically an Olympian caliber tea master, man.
Isn't that ridiculous? I think that's it's absolutely absurd. It's like, it's a 6,000-year-old culture. Like, if I spend the rest of my life studying tea, just tea is 6,000 years documented culture. If I spend the rest of my life studying tea, if I spend the rest of my life just studying the tea in Taiwan, I will die with a lot to learn. So, like certifications and titles and tea masters, all of that I think is silly. At the end of the day, it's worlds of knowledge, and I'm just fortunate enough to taste it sometimes,
Looking like a true tea master. Super humble. I mean, this guy has way more knowledge than we will ever know. But thank you for being helpful about it.
Yeah, man,
we have a question from the chat. Where is JoJo Tea located? Now, I know you mentioned it, but I don't know if you want to mention the.
Sure. Our tasting room is in the Coral Gables, Little Havana area of Miami. We actually just signed the lease today, though. We're moving to a new space, and we're opening up a new headquarter on 76th Street in Biscayne, in the kind of Mimo, Miami Shores area. So we'll be opening up. Our plan is to open up by August 10th. The best way to keep in touch, is to follow us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram, and we'll be announcing it there. So I had a kind of like in order to understand tea, I'd like to kind of start with a discussion on I think that it's important to kind of take a look at the word tea. And, if we're talking about what is tea, I think we got to start with the sound tea, right? And what does that sound mean? What does that word mean? And what's its history, right? So if we trace the history of the word tea, around the 1600s, Dutch traders brought back, and by traders, I mean merchants. I don't mean like bad Benedict Arnold. So Dutch merchants brought from the east coast of China this plant. And there were these leaves that you would put in hot water and then drink. And the Dutch merchants called it té, T-E, just like in Spanish, it's té, right? So the British, when they were introduced to this beverage, which they loved, obviously, historically, they called it tea. And that's why we call it tea. But so let's take a look at, the Dutch were calling it té. And why did they call it té? Where did they get that from? So the Dutch found this beverage. They found people drinking this beverage in the 1600s in China, in the east coast of China, specifically in what today we call Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and these fishing villages and trading posts. They found that the locals would drink these leaves in hot water, and those locals called it che, and that's C-H-E in Cantonese, right? I'm sorry, not in Cantonese, in the local dialects in these areas. They called it che, C-H-E. So when the Dutch got back, they kind of switched from che to te, and then it became tea. Now, those local dialects called it che, so where did they get that from, right? If you trace the history of that, in Mandarin, the word is cha, and to this day, it's still cha in Mandarin. As you trace that, as that word and that plant went westward into India, it became chai. So that's where we get our chai lattes from. It became chai, and in Russian, I believe it's also chai, and in Arabic, it's sha. So all of these different sha, chai, cha, che, te, and tea are all describing this one particular plant, right? And that plant is called Camellia sinensis. And so Camellia sinensis is where we get white tea, black tea, oolong tea, and then there are more rare categories of tea, yellow tea, pu'er tea, and dark or post-fermented teas. Okay, all of that. I don't think I mentioned green tea also. So white, green, oolong, black, pu'er, fermented teas, and yellow teas. This all comes from the same plant. That plant is called Camellia sinensis. Now, what about chamomile tea? What about peppermint tea? In America, you could take any plant and put it in hot water for a little bit, and then take it out, and then we call that a tea. So I think it's important for us to make a distinction, at least for the purpose of this class, that what we're going to call true tea is Camellia sinensis, and that's and then we're gonna break that down and talk about what are the different categories of Camellia sinensis. So we'll touch briefly on herbal teas and herbal infusions, but that's its own world. There's you could look at all of traditional Chinese medicine in its entire thousands and thousands and thousands of year history, if you want to really get down to the nitty gritty of what these herbs do. But that's just beyond my pay grade, right? I'm focused on tea because that's its own world, and just in that's enough. That's a very difficult subject to master. So that's what I'm trying to do. So okay, now that we have a shared vocabulary of what tea is, let's talk about its history a little bit, right? And the history of its relationship with humanity. And my goal is to kind of trace its history, and along its history, discuss the different categories of tea as they came about. So that, and along the lines, I'll define those categories so that we have a really clear understanding of what the difference is between white tea and green tea and oolong tea and black tea, etc. All right. So, it's a plant, right? So it all starts in like the Big Bang, right? That's when the Earth started and the plants formed. Now, the reason that I take it back so far is because during the last ice ages, we had glaciers that covered most of the planet. But the tea bushes were nestled in the valleys of the Himalayas. And the Himalayas are the tallest mountain ranges in the world. So the glaciers couldn't get over the Himalayas. So tea actually comes from the ridges in those Himalayas. And as such, it predates the last ice ages. So it has a particularly ancient DNA when compared to most other current plant species. If you under, I'm used to asking, like, do you understand? Are you following me? But I'm like, yes. If I ask, do you understand? I might like just to make sure.
We're getting there.
Yeah. During the last ice ages, the glaciers covered most of the world, but couldn't get over the Himalayas. Those plants that come from those valleys predate the last ice ages. They're several million years old, right? So the history of the tea bush of Camellia sinensis, it's impossible to say when it first sprouted, right? And as such, it's actually also impossible to say when its relationship with humanity started. So I'll tell you what we know, right? We know that in the year 2737 BC, there was a book written in China by Shen Nong that's actually called the Shen Nong. And it's considered like the divine emperor's encyclopedia of herbs. So like this is a book that, you know, just has it's very rudimentary, a list of every known herb and what its medicinal property was, right? And it's very specific, like, you know, this tea is very good for headaches. This plant is very good for your small intestine. This plant is very good to make you feel cooler. When it gets to tea, it says this plant is the emperor of all medicinal herbs. And the only thing that it says as its effect is it brightens the eyes. I think that's like beautifully mysterious. Like, this one is the emperor. This one's the best one. This one, oh my God, what does it do? Does it make you live forever? No, it brightens the eyes. Oh, what does that mean? So I think that's for a long time, that was considered the first documented mention of tea. And, you know, when we say, oh, what's the history of tea? For a long time, people said, oh, it starts in 2737 BC. But recently, there have been tombs that were excavated that were in the Yunnan province of China that had sealed ceramics with loose leaf tea inside. And those tombs were from about 4000 BC. So in 4000 BC, tea was considered important enough for people to take it with them into the next life. So it's impossible to know when our relationship with tea began, but we can certainly say that it's at least 6,000 years, right?
Wow.
So let's start there, right? Now, the way that tea started, from what we know, it looks like people were kind of chewing on the leaves to get some of the caffeine and antioxidants and so forth. We know that the first tea drinkers had a practice that's kind of similar to what current matcha looks like. And when I say matcha, I'm not talking about a matcha latte at Starbucks. I'm talking about like pure ceremonial matcha. Okay. So what is matcha? Matcha, we would pluck the leaves, no matter what, we pluck from the tips of the branches of the Camellia sinensis bush, because that's the youngest part of the whole bush. And it's full of caffeine, of antioxidants. It's the most densely concentrated part of the bush as far as nutrients go. So the original tea drinkers, they would pluck that tea and then steam it. After steaming it, they would compress it into a cake. And then it was ready to be shipped, when I say shipped, on a donkey, not on a ship, right? And then it could sit in somebody's house for years. And at the point that they would drink the tea, they would take that compressed cake and they would scrape off a bit of the tea into a mortar and pestle. And then they would grind that down into a powder and then whisk that with water. And that would create like a white froth. And that was called white tea originally. What we call white tea today is something very different, right? But there are certain teas called Anji Bai Cha, for example, that it's a green tea. But Bai Cha means green tea, or white tea. But Anji Bai Cha is a green tea. So how could it be called Anji white tea, right? And it's because it comes from the year 600 and it was originally used to make the ancient white tea, you know? So, okay, so that's kind of like how the practice of tea drinking started, right? They would steam these leaves, compress them into a cake, cut them up and grind them, right? Now, around the year 700, and if we had to relate this to a category, this would be to a modern day tea category. This would be as closely related to modern day green tea, because the definition of green tea is that it's not oxidized. So it's plucked and then it's cooked as quickly as possible to capture its kind of like raw state, to capture all of the antioxidants, to capture all the amino acids that are, and all the polyphenols that are natural to those buds, if you will. So, so that's kind of like you can think of this as the introduction to the more ancient style of green tea, which involved steaming the leaves as the way to cook the leaves, right? That's how it all started. Now, around the 700s, Japanese Buddhist monks, so it started spreading throughout China in this way, and most specifically amongst Buddhist monks and meditators. Tea has a really interesting chemical quality where it has a balance of something called caffeine and something called L-theanine. We're all familiar with caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant, but L-theanine actually helps us with focus, and it works on the other hemisphere of the brain. So that makes it particularly good for meditation because it's stimulating enough that they can stay up, but then it helps with focus enough that those monks didn't feel like they needed to go wash the dishes or go water the plants or go, etc. Right? They were able to keep the stimulation and the focus balanced, and that was the use of tea, the ancient use, the original use of tea. Right? Now, as Japanese Buddhist monks in the 700s made their way into China to learn, the sutras, the scriptures, to learn more meditation practices, to learn more about the teachings of the Buddha, they were all introduced to this wild beverage that these Chinese people were drinking, where they would whisk this water together and then you could stay up all night meditating, So they would all bring a little bit of tea back and bring a little bit of tea back starting in the 700s, right? So just kind of remember that in one side of the mind. And then we'll continue to talk about the development of tea in China. So this stuff starts sneaking its way into Japan. Japanese start working with this style. Now, by like the year 1000, the Chinese start experimenting with the idea of pan-firing tea, because they found that if they pluck tea leaves and then pan-fire them and then let them sit and ferment for about a year, those tea leaves would never go bad. And you could drink those teas 30 years later, 40 years later, it wasn't a problem. And meanwhile, they had an entire market in Tibet that was dying for tea because they're 30,000 feet above sea level. They couldn't grow anything but onions, So they needed to get nutrients somehow. And the Chinese discovered that if they pan-fired these tea leaves and then let them ferment, even if they got to Tibet a year later, it doesn't matter. The tea is still going to be good for years and decades after that. So the Chinese start working on this idea of pan-firing tea leaves, right? And they notice that if they pan-fire the tea leaf and then roll the leaf to break down the cell walls and make the oils more readily available, and then dry those leaves, that became a very kind of a delicious, fruity, floral, nutty, ricey kind of flavor profile. And that's what we call modern green tea. Green tea is basically Chinese green tea, right, is plucked, pan-fired, rolled, and then dried. That first pan-firing is a lot like blanching vegetables, right? If we slice an apple and we leave it out, it will start oxidizing and it will start turning brown as the sugar and the water reacts with the air. But if we boil those apples for a little bit and then we take them out, we kill the enzymes and the chemicals that would allow it to oxidize, right? So basically, green tea is just blanched, rather, right? It's plucked and then pan-fired. Now, that starts making its way through. I see we have a couple questions. Should we pause and take some questions?
It's funny because I had just said thanks for all the questions we're going to ask more towards the end. But it's up to you. We can. I
think Yeah, why don't we do this? Because like right now we've discussed, like, the origins of tea. We've discussed the birth of what is currently known as matcha and what is currently known as green tea. I think this would be a good place to stop and see and go through some questions. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I have a question here. Did you always have an affinity for Asian culture? Have you had the opportunity to live in Asian culture for a sustained period?
I haven't always had an affinity. I mean, it's really strange to contemplate, because no, I haven't, but I've always had an affinity for. I was a boxer growing up, and then I became and then I went to acting school. And in acting school, we did a lot of yoga, and we did a lot of tai chi, as a work with movement and breath. And it fascinated me, and I wanted to learn as much about it as possible. And it was more a focus on, like, spiritual exercises, right? On the idea of spirituality as a practice that involved actual exercises. Obsessed me. I was like, dude, you mean, like, there's, like, this is amazing. It's like it was a practice. It was a living, breathing practice, and that really fascinated me. And I wanted to learn as much about it as possible. And then learning about Asian culture and tea in particular was an unintended consequence of, like, trying to get down to some of those practices.
Yeah, I think anybody who's been a part of any kind of Asian culture would encounter tea at some point.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, I'm sure you could comment on that. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, having lived there for in different parts of Asia for 10 years, we certainly were, like, introduced to it, and I realized how little I knew, and how important it is.
Absolutely.
It seems to be the center point of a lot of you know ceremonies,
Hmm.
special occasions, celebrations.
But you know what's really cool about it is how trivial it is at the same time. You know what I mean? It's, like, so ritualistic and celebrated and exalted, and at the same time, it's such an afterthought and so trivial and so ubiquitous,
Yeah.
that's what I think is, like, the magic about tea, is that it's like humanity. It's like from the top to the bottom, from the left to the right. It's like it's there. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I love tea of all kinds, but then I've been to Japan a few times,
Yes, sir.
and the tea ceremony is a big deal, but the
Of course.
taste of the tea they use is, in my opinion, not that good. I have not I enjoyed the ceremony the proper way, but in terms of tea, I think I prefer oolong tea or Assam tea way more than Japanese whatever tea it is. What have they done to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to remember, in Japanese tea ceremony, it's like, you're drinking the whole leaf, and with very little water. They grind the tea leaf, and you're drinking about if it's as much water as a shot of espresso, that's a lot, right? So to have a powdered green tea in that it's like, even, like, very high grade. If you're not used to drinking that, it can be very abrasive. It can be very, like, whoa, what is that?
What have I done, right?
Yeah, exactly. How could people drink
I
this?
appreciate the formality of the ceremony and the modesty you have to have with your fellow partners and all that, and appreciating the Asian tradition, but it doesn't taste good to me.
Yeah. I bet you would like the Taiwanese tea ceremony. That might be more up your alley.
That's awesome. We have some more questions. So, what's the best way to brew a tea bag?
A tea bag. Well, it depends it depends on what kind of it depends on a few things, really. It depends on what kind of tea it is. It depends on what kind of category of tea. And by the way, a quick side note is that there are many people that say the best way to brew a tea bag is in a garbage can. Work with loose leaf tea. I'm not going to say that.
Not fired.
No, I will answer in a more diplomatic way. At the end of the day, it's not about the bag; it's about what's inside the bag. Come on, it's tea, So if it's a green tea, I would say the best way to brew it is, if you only have access to, like, a hot water spout or a hot water outlet, and that water usually is about 205 degrees. If you're making a green tea, I would fill up your cup, make sure that the cup isn't preheated, fill up your cup, let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then put your tea bag in. Boiling water will always burn green tea. If you guys forget everything that I tell you today, just remember that. Boiling water burns green tea. And if you pour boiling water onto green tea, you're taking out the chemicals that make it taste bitter. You're taking the tannins. They'll dry out your stomach. They'll dry out your mouth. They'll make digestion very difficult. They'll cause headaches. And they taste terrible. So make sure you don't use boiling water for green tea ever, right? You'll first pour your water, let it cool a little bit. If you don't have time to let it cool, then just put a little bit of cold water in there, about a quarter. Maybe fill the cup about a quarter of the way with cold water, and then top off the rest with your boiling water, and then put your tea bag in. With any other category, heat, whether it's peppermint, chamomile, black tea, oolong tea, heat is your friend because that's going to help the extraction. So what I would recommend is first heat up your cup, pour that out, put your tea bag inside, hit it directly with your boiling water, and then cover it with a plate or something kind of heavy that's going to let the steam circulate and let the aromas concentrate in your beverage. Let it sit there for about 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and then take the lid off. And you should get a really nice aromatic infusion with a full-bodied flavor profile.
Very good. Good point. Yeah. We have another few more questions. How are flavors made?
In labs with a team of scientists that all make a lot of money, trying to figure out ways to combine natural and artificial flavorings. That's we have one tea that has flavoring in it. We have an oolong tea that has some natural peach flavoring and dehydrated peach.
We have that, by the way.
Yeah, it's a nice one. It's nice. It's actually it's a very popular tea. But we did that because Taiwanese oolongs in particular have a lot of natural peach notes, and people are not familiar with the flavor profile of Taiwanese jade oolong. And I don't want it to be so intimidating for people to get into it. So if we tie it together with peach and it has natural peach notes and people are familiar with peach and people have had peach iced tea, they tend to be a little bit more open to tasting it. And then they can kind of taste the tea that's underneath the peach flavoring. And then we make the tea base is good enough that if they pour boiling water over that bag again after they drink it, they'll be able to get more tea and it'll be more tasting like tea than peach. So it gives us an opportunity to educate the consumer in the tea bag,
Cool.
I don't know if I answered that question. It's an application of, it's usually an application of oils and liquid flavorings. The other option is there's sometimes that they'll make little, what's called like granules, where they will make those oils and then kind of like dehydrate them into a powder and then compress those powders into pellets. And then they'll mix that into the tea and put that in a tea bag. And then you have your blueberry white tea, whatever,
Nice, interesting. Here's another question. What is the best tea to use for making kombucha or fermenting kombucha?
So that depends really on what kind of flavor profile you're looking for. If you want something more like crisp and think of like a ginger and citrus, right? This kind of like crisp flavor profile. Then I would say to use more like green teas, white teas, and lightly oxidized oolong teas, right? And we'll get into what that means later as we continue our conversation about the history of tea and so forth. But if you use lightly oxidized oolong teas and green teas and white teas, you'll tend to get more crisp flavor profiles. Whereas if you use black teas and more thoroughly oxidized oolong teas, you'll tend to get more malt and depth in your kombuchas. So it depends on what you're going for. If you want something that's crisp and refreshing, I would say to go for white tea, green tea, lightly oxidized oolong. If you're going for something more like refined, more rich of an experience, then I'd say to go for a black tea, something more oxidized.
Cool. do you want to continue, or we get back to the questions later, or what do you feel?
Well, are there many more questions regarding the subject matter that we've gone over so far, or no?
Well, they're kind of tea related, but not specific to what you've gone over.
Okay, so then maybe it would make sense to save those to the end so we can. All right, cool. Okay. And if you asked any of those questions in particular, I apologize beforehand. My friend, you have a question? You're muted, my friend. I'm sorry about that.
Oh,
Yeah, you're still muted. Do you hear me? There we go.
Which tea has the most caffeine in it?
Matcha, actually, the Japanese green tea that we were discussing earlier, and it's not really. We have to remember, like, all of these teas come from the same plant, so they have really the same amount of caffeine, right? And this is a note that we're going to discuss after the timeline, right? But what's important to understand is when you drink matcha, again, because you drink the whole leaf and you ingest the entire leaf, you end up taking in about 4 times the caffeine than you do with regularly brewed loose leaf tea. Okay, you understand?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Yes, sir. Thank you. All right, we're good, Chef.
Yeah, let's keep going with the discussion, and then we can come back to these questions that we have. So if anybody has these questions that they saw that we didn't address them, we will get to it at the end.
And I really appreciate you guys' questions. Please don't be shy in asking them. Yeah, there's I think that there's no such thing as a question that's too elementary. Okay, so now let's go back to, we were at around the year 1000, right, where they were setting up like the Silk Road and the Tea Horse Road, and they were sending tea into Tibet, and they were messing with the idea of pan-firing teas. Right now, as the idea of pan-firing teas was developing, tea had really caught on in Japan, and people were planting tea bushes in Japan and growing tea bushes in Japan and developing tea farms in Japan, right? And they were developing these tea farms along the same lines and methods of production that they had learned going back to the 700s. And remember, Japan is off of the east coast of China, right? Meanwhile, all the way west by Tibet, which I guess I should go like this, all the way west by Tibet, they're starting to mess with pan-firing these teas. And that starts slowly spreading its way throughout China. By the time that it gets to East Coast China, it's about the 1200s, and Japan has a thoroughly developed culture of steamed green teas and matcha and tea ceremony. The tea ceremony was developed, as a quick side note, to go back to my friend's conversation. This is fascinating to me anyway. There was a Japanese man named Sen no Rikyu that was considered like the father of Japanese tea ceremony, right? A very well accomplished Buddhist monk. And he had developed his tea ceremony. And the shogun, which is like the warlord, the warlord under the emperor of Japan, he invited Sen no Rikyu to come do a tea ceremony for him, right? Sen no Rikyu comes and does the tea ceremony, and then the shogun says, wow, this is great. I feel very relaxed. I feel very focused. I feel very clear-minded. I want you to do this, please, for all of my generals and soldiers before they go to war. So Sen no Rikyu's like, oh, great. He had only been making tea for monks, and now all of a sudden he's got to work with soldiers, So he was not exactly looking forward to it, right? But whatever the shogun says, you've got to do. So he starts doing it, and a lot of these men would come, and they had never had tea before, and they would sit down and they would drink their tea, and then they would go to war and die. So Sen no Rikyu said, after he had been doing this for a bit, he said, well, I've dedicated my life to tea. How would I drink tea if it were my first time ever drinking tea? And if it were my last time ever drinking tea? So there's a saying in Japanese, ichigo, ichi-e. It means one lifetime, one moment, So that's the whole idea. Japanese tea ceremony is 3 hours long. You only drink tea for 15 minutes. Because the question is, how would you drink tea if it was your first time ever and your last time ever?
Wow.
So that's the kind of weight and gravity that the Japanese brought to tea, right? So now, while this is going on, China is continuing to develop, and they have a dynastic change, right? By the 1200s, we have merchants going to the Arabic Peninsula, and they're bringing tea with them. And now Arabic tea culture starts developing. And the Chinese emperor decides in the 1200s that they don't, like the powdered tea was backwards. The powdered tea is for savages. The powdered tea is for the people of the past. Modern day Chinese drink whole leaf tea, loose leaf tea, right? So then China switches over. They stop steaming tea. They're only doing pan-fired tea. And Japan continues on their matcha kick, which Starbucks is very thankful for today. So meanwhile, China is continuing to develop their green tea, right? And they have all of these different green teas where this one is just the bud. This one is the bud and the first leaf. This one is the bud and the first 2 leaves. And the thing that they all have in common is that they're plucked and then they're pan-fired. After that, they're shaped, which could be pressing flat, like in the case of a tea called Dragonwell or Longjing, that the tea looks flat like paper. Then there's another tea called Mao Feng, where instead of flattening the leaves, they're rolled. So the leaves are more twisty, right? Either way, the point is that the leaves are shaped, and that shaping breaks down the cell walls, making the polyphenols and the antioxidants and the amino acids a lot more readily available, a lot easier to pull out of the leaf and into the water, right? So as they continue to develop this, around the 1400s, there's a mountain, well, the mountain's called Wuyi, W-U-Y-I, Wuyi Mountain. Wuyi Mountain around the 1400s, some monks start messing with the idea of rolling the tea leaf before it's cooked. So they would pluck tea leaves, allow it to sit and soften, and then roll those leaves. And when they rolled those leaves, they noticed that that would cause bruising in the leaf. And as the leaves were bruising, it's because the veins in the leaf were bursting, and the oil and the sugar and the juice was bleeding into the leaf. And after this process of rolling, now the leaves would oxidize a lot more quickly, and they would start getting darker and darker and darker, right? They found that once it reached the desired level of oxidation or of darkness, then they would roast it over charcoal, and that would stop the oxidation, that would caramelize the sugars, that would remove the water. And then the leaf was ready to be transported and drank. So this idea was born around the 1400s of oxidizing tea leaves, right? Now, I think the next very significant point in the history of tea is when we look at the 1600s, right? When those European merchants that we were discussing earlier get to China, right? Now, the Chinese people have a robust oolong tea practice at this time. Oolong tea is drank all over China. Green tea is drank all over China. And of course, these merchants that were arriving from this faraway land didn't know anything about tea. And like, once you get into the more high level teas, you have to have something of a trained palate in order to be able to appreciate the difference between, like anybody can tell the difference between a tea that's 4 cents per gram and a tea that's $12 per gram. You'd be able to tell the difference. But, between a tea that's 75 cents a gram and $2 a gram, that's not necessarily the case, and that translates into quite a big difference in price and in value. So as these like uneducated palates were arriving to China, they would allow the tea to ferment completely or to oxidize completely. They would roll the leaves and then forget about them, and then come back the next day and roast them. And that became what we currently call black tea. Okay, what we currently call black tea, they call red tea in China hong cha, and we're talking about the color of the leaf, whereas the Chinese are talking about the color of the brewed liquor, right? So it's a much clumsier process. Oolong tea takes, from pluck to cup, takes at least 48 hours of constant attention, you know? Black tea, you can forget about it for 12 to 24 hours at a time and you're good, you know? So that's how the European culture, I say I'm a Cuban kid from Miami, but that's my ancestry as well. So that's how we were introduced to this flavor profile, right? And that's how it came to inform the ideas that come into our mind when the word tea comes and those flavor profiles come up. That's how it came to us historically, right? Then we get to the 1700s. The 1700s is where white tea is invented. And it's invented in also in East Coast China in a city called Fuding in the Fujian province, where it was a very poor town that had high elevation tea gardens that had big buds and very thin leaves because it was such high elevation. And they were trying to find a way to make tea production less expensive because the labor was too expensive for them, you know? Oolong tea production, like I said, can be 48 hours, just constant attention. And that's not even discussing the pluck, you know, and plucking is its own world of labor. So what they started experimenting with in Fuding was the idea of plucking tea and sun drying it. They would do them on raised beds and kind of angle the bed to take advantage of the passing wind. So it's almost like sailing. And that process was developed in the 1700s. What we currently call white tea is that, simply sun-dried pluckings from the Camellia sinensis bush. Okay? Now, that takes us to the 1700s. I think, like, in order to discuss the modern history of tea, I think it's really important to include the British and Chinese, I should say, like the British colonial and Chinese imperial kind of competition, because I think that is really important to kind of bridge the gap between the 1600s and 1700s and where we are today, and why we have the definitions of tea that we have in American culture. Okay. So do we want to open up to any questions? Are there questions along the way, or should we continue, Chef?
We have questions.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a pause. Yeah.
Let me see. Sorry.
I think, my friend, I see you leaning forward. You're still on mute though. So let's get you off of mute.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
If I remember, the United States had in the Department of Interior, I think, an official tea taster. No, there really was. I think
I believe that.
The issue was what was the quality of tea entering the United States through all these clippers. So they hired a man, and I think I read about it maybe 20 years ago, and I think they finally stopped this particular position in the Department of Interior. But until that time, there was an official tea taster to help monitor the quality of the teas brought into the United States.
Well, you know, the tea that was brought into the United States, really up until the 70s, when President Nixon made his way into China and things opened up a little bit. I mean, the quality of that tea, the quality of the labor practices on the farms from which they came, the quality of the farming practices were all the reason that grocery tea is priced as it is. Let me put it like that. Because it's not like that's ancient history. That's the reason that most of the brands in the groceries and at CVS are priced the way they are, because those products come to us from colonial systems, you know. And you know, 75% of Sri Lanka's tea gardens operate at a loss and are subsidized by the government. You know, it's I don't know when it's gonna come, but there's gonna be a reckoning in the commodity tea market that is way past due, I think, you know, unfortunately, but that's just how it is. You know, things have consequence.
We have a question here. How long can tea last for? I guess
That depends on that's a tricky question, right? Because do you mean after it's been brewed, or do you mean dry leaves? So let's answer both of those questions, I guess. Once it's been brewed, I definitely don't recommend keeping tea for more than, at the very most, if you're a restaurant and you're making 3 gallons of tea, I recommend at the very most 8 hours. You know, by 12 hours, you're pushing it. You're really pushing it, you know. In 24 hours, you've already got fermentation happening, and the flavor profile is significantly different. I mean, significantly different. 36 hours in, it's awful. It's a it's a different beverage. It's a different beverage. Like it's the flavor profile is so bad, it's traumatic to even remember it. It's terrible. I mean, it's nauseating. It's terrible, you know. So that's what I would say for brewed tea. Okay. Now, for tea leaves, that depends on the category of tea, okay? Now, green tea, you want to drink that as fresh as possible. Green tea, that's the rule, as fresh as possible, no matter what, right? The best green tea is harvested in early spring. So what that means is that the following winter, the freshest possible is from last spring, and that's just the best that you can do, and so be it, you know? The difference in quality between green tea that's harvested in late summer and early spring is so noticeable that you're better off sticking to the early spring stuff, right? But now black tea and oolong tea, those can be aged. And there's a lot of experimentation going on with that. White tea ages beautifully. White tea ages really well. But there's a separate category that I want to talk about. This is a good time to bring up, that this is a category of tea called pu'er. And the history of pu'er is very mysterious because it comes from, okay, the Yunnan province of China is the birthplace of tea by all documentation, right? This is where the ancient tribes of the Yunnan province traded tea and worshiped tea. I've been to temples on Bulang Mountain where the temple is made out to tea, and the god holds a staff, and the tip of the staff is the tea bud. And they don't think that man cultivated and civilized tea. They think that tea cultivated and civilized man. And in man's quest to learn to interact with the tea bush, we learned how to operate in harmony with nature and with each other. And tea is worshipped as such. Because in that area, the species of tea that grows, if you plant a seed and you don't cut it, it will not stop growing. And the oldest tea tree in the world that's known is in the Yunnan province, and it's over 3,000 years old. It's the size of a 3-story building. It's huge. You know, you could see it from miles away. So in this pocket of the world, you know, and particularly considering the ancestral worship of Chinese and Taoist ancient cultures, right? If there's a 1,000-year-old tea tree, my grandmother drank from that tree. Her grandmother drank from that tree. Her grandmother drank from that tree. Her grandmother drank from that tree. So this tree is a spirit that's connecting my entire ancestry with me, you know? So there's a sacredness to tea in the Yunnan province, as particularly on mountains like Bulang Mountain. You know, in some parts of the Yunnan province, it's just a commodity. It's okay, whatever. You know, we grow it, we make tea. It's an artful, but you know, it doesn't like transcend into the sacred. You know, there are certain mountains where any tree that's over 500 years old, once a year, the entire village will go and worship that tree and do prostrations and lay down in front of it and thank it for feeding their ancestors, you know, and so forth. And I've done it with them. I don't know if they were selling me some Mickey Mouse tourist garbage, but but I was there, you know, I saw it. It's very much alive in many of these cultures, you know. And the last note that I want to say about this particular style of tea, this style of tea, pu'er, it's called, 2 syllables, pu'er. It's usually spelled P-U-E-R-H, pu'er. Pu'er can only come from tea trees over about, at the very least, 60 years old, but it should be about 100 years old, where the older the tree, the deeper the roots. The deeper the roots, the more minerals are coming into the leaves. The more minerals that the leaves have, the better the tea will be able to age. So pu'er is, you know, for the wine lovers out there, you can compare it to like a Barolo. Pu'er is the kind of tea that you pluck it, and when you taste it while it's fresh, it's aggressive, it's abrasive, it's savory, it's tannic, it's sharp. But you taste that same tea 14 years later, and it tastes like tobacco and figs and prunes and rose petals, and the flavor profile lasts with you for breath after breath after breath after breath. Now, how old can pu'er get? So the oldest pu'er that I've ever tasted, Chef and I, we were discussing this before we went live. The oldest pu'er that I've ever tasted was from 1888. And the man that offered it to me to taste it paid well over $500,000. He paid about $450,000 for about 250 grams of this tea. So that's a little over a half a pound. So it's a tea that's about $500,000 per pound. A tea from ancient tea trees, old tea trees. The leaves were plucked, pan-fired, rolled, and sun-dried, and then aged for a year. And then they were steamed and rolled up into a ball and then pressed between two stones to create a tea cake, which is what this is right here. This is a tea cake. I'll bring it a little closer because I know that it doesn't look like you can really see much there. But see, this is the ticket where, you know, the brand that makes each tea cake will usually insert their ticket within the tea cake. And this cake is made out of the buds and the leaves of the tea bush. You see how there's different colors here? These lighter colors here are the buds, and the darker colors in the background are the leaves. So this is a tea cake of raw pu'er. There's a different category of pu'er that's called ripe pu'er, where they take the same, oh, wait. I got to finish the 1888 tea. I didn't finish. So the tea was plucked, pan-fired, rolled, sun-dried, aged for a year, and then steamed, compressed into a cake, and sealed in a ceramic case. And then it was offered to the Qing Dynasty Emperor in 1888. And he didn't have time to drink it before he passed away. And it's been sealed since then. It went on auction in 2017. So this guy paid like 450 grand for one of the cakes. It's crazy, huh?
It would even feel like, how could you drink that, you know?
Oh, like this.
It's like
just
you're
like this.
drinking
I'll show you.
something from the
like
Smithsonian, you know?
Like this, just like this.
Yeah.
Just like that. Dude,
Just
you know what's crazy? What was crazy about it is that, like, when I drank that tea, I didn't taste anything for about a minute and a half. It tasted almost like water with unsalted butter, just like thick water. And I didn't taste anything. And I was like thinking about it as, you know, I drank it, I swallowed it. I was waiting for the finish. I didn't get anything. I was like, I can't believe it. This guy just paid 450 grand and this tastes like water, you know? Dude, no lie. After like, and you know, the teapot that he shared between him and I did some math. It was about $8,000 worth of tea just for that little teapot. So I drank the tea. I didn't taste anything. About 2.5 minutes later, something between like a minute and a half, 2.5 minutes, something in that area. There was like a little bit of flavor coming like at the base of my throat, a kind of flavor of like tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
And it's truthfully, this is why it's like, yeah, I think it's, you know, it could very well be worth it, because like with every passing breath after that, the intensity of flavor increased. And it was like, and at its full bloom, it was like I was discussing earlier, it was like tobacco, rose petals, prunes, talcum powder, wet wood, buttered mushroom, like all of these different notes and I tasted it for about an hour and a half, 2 hours off of a cup about this big. You know, I don't know if you can see that little cup. You know,
That's insane.
yeah. I mean, I think that there are teas that their flavor profile, you know, because I don't have a cultural history with tea, you know, but there are teas that when I taste them, their flavor profile is like it's like it's speaking to this part of me that is older than I am. You know, it's I don't know if it's like I'm just a romanticizing fool, but like there's a recognition. You know, there's this recognition that it's like a flavor that I recognize, even though I know I've never tasted it. And like what I like to tell myself is that it has to do with what we were discussing earlier, like the ancient quality of the DNA of tea. That it's something that's so integrated in the DNA of life itself on planet Earth that it's recognizable even if we have no cultural relationship with it. You know.
Oh.
I don't know. I think that.
No, no for sure.
Well,
asked as hold on, sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll through. I don't want to miss it.
Sure.
Somebody did ask about the scroll behind you.
Oh, sure.
What does it say?
So
what is the text?
This scroll says, "Miami is the shit, bro." I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. I have too much fun. The scroll. It's a very ancient Chinese saying, and it goes to like we were talking about how tea spread throughout the world with the development of meditators, right? And it was very much in harmony with the spread of Zen Buddhism in particular, right? So this is, it reads from right to left because it's in the ancient script. So it's Chan. Chan means Zen, both as a practice and as an experience, right? The experience of enlightenment and the practice of meditation, Zen, right? Chan. Cha is tea. E is the number one. And wei means flavor or taste. So it Chan Cha Yi Wei means Zen tea, one taste, same flavor. Zen tea, same flavor, one taste, you know?
Awesome. So somebody asked, and I think we definitely know the answer here. Do you recommend anywhere locally where we can buy fine teas?
Yeah, absolutely. The Betsy Hotel is a wonderful place. So I guess the question is like, are you trying to buy tea to take home and drink, or are you trying to go drink tea somewhere? You know, if you'd like to go drink tea somewhere, the Betsy Hotel has a wonderful tea program. You know, if you're looking more for like a coffee shop that you want to go sit down and hang out at, you know, Vice City Bean has a wonderful tea program. Imperial Moto has a really nice tea. Moto, like a motorcycle, has a really nice tea program. If you're looking to buy tea to drink at home, I certainly recommend sipjojo.com. That's our website. I would direct you to our tea room, but we're about to move up to 76th Street in Biscayne. So very soon we'll be in the Little Haiti, Mimo, Miami Shores kind of area, and we'll be available for retail sales there. And if you find that you're interested in tea and you're a little bit intimidated by the different categories, well, should I start with a green tea? Should I start with an oolong tea? Should I start with a black tea? Something that we offer as a seasonal subscription is called the JoJo Club. And we basically send out a curated selection of teas 4 times per year that are basically what are the teas that I would be most excited to drink during this season, right? So you'll get some teas that are on the JoJo menu, the JoJo tea menu, and you'll also get some teas that I'm able to kind of collect from personal relationships that I've made over the years in the tea industry. And you'll get some kind of like really special teas and some more rare teas, and then you'll also get some nice kind of everyday teas that you could. I like to compare it to like this. The everyday teas are like for your moment of peace, and then the top shelf teas are for your special moments. There are teas that are basically you name a price point, and there are teas at that price point. And if tea is an important part of your life, then the tea that you're drinking at the moment should reflect that, right? There's enough depth in the tea world to make it so why not? It will only add richness.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've had the pleasure of listening to you for over an hour now. We're 5 minutes over.
Wow, time flies, man.
It flew by.
Yeah.
And we know we have some people that probably would love to stay and listen. I know that some people are messaging saying that they have to leave, but we want to thank you for your time. Is there anything else that you want to get in there? Any last words for us, or anything?
Well, I mean, what I would want to say specifically is like, I mean, so first I have to do my like I have to speak heart to heart to you all. Like I obviously believe in tea. I don't know why. I don't know why it's snuck into my life and taken over as such. Truthfully, I tasted a cup of tea one day. I was like, how do people not have this? And since then, it's been a million miles an hour tea, and I would have it no other way. But it's truthfully like it is such a beautiful practice, such a beautiful habit, such a beautiful hobby. I believe that the practice of having moments of tea is the practice of curating moments of peace. And the practice of serving tea, even if you're serving tea to yourself, is a humbling experience, is a spiritual practice. It can be, right? And I encourage you to explore tea. Of course, yeah, go to my website, sipjojo.com, and check us out. But go to YouTube and look up videos on tea. It's got such a fascinating history and such a interconnected history with subjects like Taoism and Buddhism, and subjects like geopolitics and British colonial government and the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. Ring a bell? Like, there's so much. The integrations and the dynamics between tea and humanity, I think, you can spend the rest of your life studying it, and yet every sip is so peaceful, and every sip delivers, and it could be a ritual that means the world, and it can be an afterthought with dessert. And I think that should be celebrated,
Absolutely. Words of wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for your time. Yeah, thanks for joining.
The pleasure was ours. And for those asking, yes, the video is being recorded and will be available on our Facebook page. And you can always go back and refer to it, because I know Mike dropped a lot of information. And I know I definitely will also be going back to reference some of those things. So thank you so much, Mike. It's been a real honor and a real privilege to know you and to have this conversation with everyone. Thanks to everyone for all the questions. Sorry if we didn't get a chance to touch on everybody's questions, but definitely reach out to us and we can answer any of your questions that you may have that are pending.
Yeah, and if you guys are, and usually like we're very active on Instagram. I don't know if you folks are on Instagram, but if you send a direct message to JoJo T on Instagram, that'll come through to me, and I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you have. Okay.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Mike, and thanks for everybody joining in. And until the next time, we'll see you, and stay safe, everyone. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.